Welcome everybody to this year's Prawer lecture. Just as a reminder, most people present will know it celebrates the memory of Siegbert Prawer, who was my predecessor in the Oxford chair and celebrated as not just as a substantial scholar, but also as a very fine performer. And this lecture is always given every year by a young scholar who is just starting on a career. And there's something appropriate about that because performance is a great aspect, a necessary and important aspect of our position as university lecturers. The universities are there to teach people above all, never mind the research. And for somebody just starting off to do it, as it were, under the auspices of Siegbert Prawer is singularly appropriate. We also have, just to keep up the family connection, Johnny Prawer, Siegbert's son, in the audience. He always kindly comes along to sit in on the occasion. Martin Lindner is our lecturer this year, and he is doing a DPhil at Oxford, at Brasenose College, my own college, I'm delighted to say. And he is working, he comes in as a German. He was born in, he came from Bavaria, but did his first German degree in Leipzig on the grounds of the excellent reputation of that university for Germanistic. And he's got a master's from Cambridge, which is the preparatory stage before working on a doctorate. His doctorate, in the most broad and general terms, concerns cultural, political, social interrelationships between the various components of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, under the idea of colonialism or the idea of rebellion and the rise of political movements. Anyway, that's the general, I think you would agree, the general scope. But specifically, he works on Marie von Ebner-Eschenbach and on the kind of relationships that can be demonstrated and the aesthetic effects they have in her narrative fiction. That's a very concrete and specific subject, which is what one's research ought to be centered on. And that's what Martin is going to talk about today. So I will leave the floor now to him.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I will just share my slides. I hope you can all see them. If that is the case, I'll make it start. So once again, thank you very much for the kind introduction, dear members of the English Goethe Society. First and foremost, I'm incredibly grateful and honored to having been invited to give this year's Prawer lecture. And I think the prize is a great institution generally to support career researchers and emerging scholars. Today, I'm going to present part of my doctoral research on countervoices to the rise of nationalist discourses in late 19th century Austria-Hungary through the example of the writer Marie von Ebner-Eschenbach. And I know while both temporally and spatially my topic is a bit removed from the, if you may excuse the pun, locus classicus of the English Goethe Society, I hope that my discussion of what it means to try to write in a language of sameness that counteracts the rhetoric of national division might give thoughts on political dynamics that remain highly topical today. Now, let me start with a quote that can sort of serve as the guiding thought throughout the lecture. Es kam mir nicht vor, dass meine Gedanken gebürtige Deutsche wären. Als kleine Kinder hatten wir fast nur Böhmisch und später dann fast nur Französisch gesprochen. Writes Ebner-Eschenbach in her autobiographical account Meine Kinderjahre. Born in 1830 in the multi-ethnic region of Moravia in the Habsburg Empire, Ebner-Eschenbach only chose German as a literary language in her early 20s. After an initially shaky start of her literary career with dramatic works in the 1860s and 70s, Ebner advanced to the status of the Grande Dame of Austro-German literature with her later prose fiction, being the first woman to receive an honorary doctorate at the University of Vienna in 1900. Recent scholarship has worked to correct the popular image of the author that came with this late fame as an altersweise and harmonizing Dichterin der Güte, in whose writing conflicts are somewhat didactically resolved by an ethos of Christian charity and humanism. Against this reductive view, scholars have in the last 2 decades pointed out her fierce social criticism, complex negotiations of female authorship, and her depiction of national relations in multi-ethnic Moravia, which will be the focus of my lecture today. Given Ebner-Eschenbach's success around 1900, the depiction of Czech-German relations indeed carries significant importance for the study of national discourses in late Austria-Hungary. Worley contends, man kann sogar behaupten, dass Ebners Konstruktionen eine der Hauptquellen für literarische Bilder des Slawisch-Tschechischen für ihr Lesepublikum waren. This is even more the case since Ebner's breakthrough in the mid-1870s occurred by successfully placing her prose works in Julius Rodenberg's Deutsche Rundschau, one of the foremost publications of German realism, which secured Ebner praise not only within Austria-Hungary, but also across the German-speaking world. When it comes to existing studies that have examined Ebner-Eschenbach's depiction of Czech-German relations in Bohemia and Moravia, however, they also seem to be united by a form of anachronism, namely a view of the Habsburg Empire that has been significantly shaped by what came after its breakdown in 1918, namely the age of the sovereign nation-states in Central Europe. Despite differing perspectives on whether Ebner-Eschenbach's works confirm or challenge common stereotypes about Czechs and Slavs at the time, what unites almost all of the existing studies is a pervasive thinking and discrete categories of national and linguistic identities, and an analytical assumption that German and Czech characters in their works are structured along distinct, binary lines of nation, ethnicity, and class. Worley, Seeling, and Isozaki all assume a clear split between higher-class positively drawn Germans and lower-class, more ambiguous Czech characters in Ebner's works. Her narratives are said to occupy a clearly delineated German position, from which they portray Czech characters as stereotypical others, and studies have also related any positive character developments that Czech-speaking protagonists undergo as a process of Germanization, the so-called Deutschwerdung, even as the initial states and the outcome are never marked as embodying Czechness or Germanness in their respective stories. Now, unquestionably, identifying common contemporary stereotypical notions of Czechness in Ebner's works constitutes a first significant step in positioning her oeuvre within its socio-political context. However, recent revisions in Habsburg historiography have questioned the degree to which national affiliations were in fact significant in the daily life of the majority of Austria-Hungary's populace, even in late 19th century. Under the theoretical concept of national indifference, revisionist Habsburg historians under the lead of Peter Björksen and Tara Zara called for a more balanced perspective on political dynamics in 19th century Central Europe. Alongside the study of nationalist ideologies that indeed sought to create a sense of ethnic division from the 1870s and onwards, they argue that equal attention should be given to phenomena that cross linguistic, confessional, and regional divides, as well as to phenomena in which collective national identification failed to crystallize, even in the context of the intense political propagation. A balanced historical sensitivity is needed even more in the context of Ebner-Eschenbach due to a structural feature of most of her fiction. While her major texts, such as Božena and Das Gemeindekind, were created in the 1870s and 80s, and therefore precisely at the time at which nationalist ideologies were on the rise in Bohemia and Moravia, the narrated time is usually set before that period. If Ebner's narrators refer to any factual historical events at all, they mostly situate the narrated time around the revolutions of 1848 or even earlier, and not in the extra-textual present of their creation. While nationalist political actors of all stripes in Austria-Hungary in this later period indeed propagated an ethnocultural idea of national identity as a belonging to whole cultures allegedly separated from each other by unbridgeable differences, national discourses in 1848 not only took a less essentialist stance, even if they were based on ideas of common language use, but they also, as Judson has shown, rarely touched the landed population, and they barely touched many people in small towns and even cities. Spatially and temporally, the rural Moravian settings of most of Ebner's prose fiction, which are placed in a nexus of Schloss, Dorf, ländliches Städtchen, would certainly fall into this latter category. Moreover, Czech nationalism was less pronounced generally in Moravia. Against the construction of a unified political entity based on the Czech language that Czech nationalists advocated for in Bohemia, Moravia always sought to maintain its independent crownland status in the political structure of the Habsburg Empire. So, instead of presupposing the salience of a binary German-Czech antagonism a priori, I am therefore proposing a more cautious interpretive route for analyzing Ebner's depiction of national relations in multi-ethnic Moravia. Drawing on a close reading of narrative form in her works, I will argue that this depiction often transcends binary categorizations of nations, language, and class, by enacting a subtle aesthetics of sameness in her prose works. Looking at two of her most famous novels, Rožena and Das Gemeindekind, I will also discuss the limits of her aesthetic political program. And yet, and this will be a final brief part of my lecture, the author seems to have been keenly aware about these limitations. Drawing on a reading of one of the writer's most formally complex works, the novella Lass die Hand küssen, I will show how Ebner negotiated the ethical dilemmas of the empathetic narrative representation of others, in a nuanced self-critique that raises poetological questions that we still grapple with in the identity discourses of today. Now, how does this subtle anti-nationalist attitude manifest itself in Ebner-Eschenbach's works? Analyzing the treatment of nationalist and colonialist discourses in the works of 19th century Austro-Hungarian writers is, I would argue, fundamentally a question of the analysis of narrative form. This is not only true in the general Bourdieuian sense, that all ideological divisions of the social world are inherently takeovers of form, core being enunciated through language, but it also has special salience in the context of the Habsburg Empire. At least until the rise of popular mass parties in the 1890s, and due to the absence of colonies abroad, nationalism and colonialism primarily manifested itself as discourse in the cultural political sphere in the Habsburg Empire. First and foremost, this pertains to the most basic formal characteristic of Ebner's texts, a characteristic so conspicuous that especially Germanistic scholars have tended to overlook its significance and have left it almost entirely uninterrogated, namely, and this might indeed sound as an underwhelming observation at first, the fact that the narrative language of her works is German. However, the mere fact that Ebner wrote in German, and the specific function of German in her texts, carries with it political implications on almost every level of her narratives, from the extra-literary realm of language policy in the Habsburg Empire to the most intricate details of intradiegetic character speech in her texts. So, before we go into the textual analysis, let me just start with a brief explanation why questions of language use were so political in Austria-Hungary, and therefore constitutes such a central analytical category. The mere fact of linguistic diversity, for example in industrialized areas, was neither unique to the Habsburg Empire at the time, nor did the simple coexistence of people who spoke different languages create national conflict by itself. language use attained a uniquely political charged meaning in Austria-Hungary due to the combination of two factors: the accounting for linguistic diversity on the one hand, and the de facto asymmetries between languages on the other. Austria-Hungary's legal structures accounted for linguistic diversity to a much greater extent than other European states at the time. Ironically, the December laws of 1867 for the Austrian half of the empire enshrined the recognition of multilingual diversity with the constitutional right to not having to learn a second regional language, which made the empire the only polity in Europe with a legal right to be monolingual. However, despite this recognition, German and the Austrian half of the empire de facto occupied a privileged position. Most prominently, this concerned the use of German as the mandated internal language of communication, the so-called innere Dienstsprache, for the supra-regional imperial bureaucracy. Not only did this policy attach a sense of high cultural capital to the knowledge of German, also imparted the language with a sense of neutrality. So it imparted the language with a sense that, with the notion that German speakers somehow stood above sectarian national interests when defending their privileges in the cultural wars in the last decades of the Habsburg Empire. In other words, it is precisely this purported neutrality of German that cemented its hegemonic status. In Bohemia and Moravia, and especially in its German language cultural sphere, this led to a hierarchization of languages. While German was seen as a super-regional prestigious language of bourgeois elites, Czech was depicted as an inferior vernacular language, the idiom of the non-educated, only spoken by peasants and servants. Notably, German and Czech mid-century nationalists alike made this argument, although for opposite ends. To dismiss demands for greater linguistic parity on the one hand, and to foster the so-called national awakening of self-conscious Czech speakers on the other. And when this sense of German as the exclusive site of cultural capital gradually diminished in parallel to the establishment of Czech cultural institutions from the 1870s and onwards, this then led to an increasingly defensive and radical German nationalism, in which fear-mongering about a Czechizierung, a so-called Czechification of public life, was a prominent topos. In a typical Austro-Hungarian fashion of coexisting contradictory realities, however, a widespread pragmatic multilingualism still continued to be a fundamental part of everyday experience. And I'm just going back to the last slide, actually, to show this once again. Especially in urban centers, multilingualism could pervade the most intimate settings in the workplace, households, and within marriages or family generations of the same family, despite its politicization in the public sphere. So, just to give one example, and that's why I put up the map again, even this map, which sort of recorded linguistic diversity in the Habsburg Empire, being based on the data of the imperial census in 1910, and it gives the percentage of German and Czech speakers in every district of Moravia. Even this map constitutes a gross oversimplification of multilingual and multinational realities on the ground, because notably, citizens were not allowed to report the multiple languages of use, which they often used in different contexts, so they only had to choose one language. As mentioned, Ebner-Eschenbach's primordial language acquisition happened in Czech. Her secondary cultural socialization then happened in French as an aristocratic child, and she only chose German as her literary language after advocacy by her cousin and later husband Moritz. And taken as a stylistic choice as a whole, Ebner's success in German as her third language in itself undermines a central tenet of nationalist thinking of a time, namely what Yasmin Yildiz has termed the monolingual paradigm, the assumption of having and writing in one ethnically predetermined language as the natural default for an individual. Moreover, it is through the specific function of German as the dominant language in her texts that the author creates spaces of linguistic indeterminacy that challenged rather than confirmed nationalist notions of rigid identities and authorities. Ebner's two major novels, Bojena from 1876 and Das Gemeindekind from 1887, are characterized by these anti-nationalist aesthetics. Both center around protagonists that are identified as Czech speakers through their names, Božena Ducha and Pavel Holub. The narrated time of Bojena spans from the 1830s to the 1860s and takes place around the fictional Moravian town of Weinberg. It follows the story of Bojena as a maidservant in the house of the wine merchant Leopold Heisenstein, Weinberg's richest man. After the death of Heisenstein's first wife, Bojena takes care of his daughter Rosa with motherly love, contrasted with the cold-hearted treatment Rosa receives from her father, stepmother Nanette, and her stepsister Regula. After Rosa escapes to follow her love Lieutenant von Fese to Hungary against her father's will, Bojena departs to find her and returns with her child Röschen in the moment of Heisenstein's death. Against Nanetten's and Regula's covert machinations to cut Röschen off from all family possessions, it is ultimately Bojena's moral integrity and care that enforces the happy end for Röschen, namely the marriage with the aristocratic Graf Ronsberg. And whether seen as an act of motherly love, of spiritual nobility, or self-sacrificing servitude in the secondary literature, the Czech-speaking female protagonist herself remains in the same subservient position as on the outset of the story, in still being a maid. Sie wiegte noch eine dritte Generation auf ihren Armen. Pavel Holub's story in Das Gemeindekind, on the other hand, is one of social advancement. Spanning exactly a decade from 1860 to 1870, the narrative follows Pavel and his sister Midalda, who are left in the care of the community in the fictional Ortschaft Soleschau in Moravia, after their alcoholic father is hanged for murder and the mother condemned to 10 years in prison. While a plötzlicher Stimmungswechsel leads the local noblewoman to take Midalda into her care and educate her in a nearby nunnery, Pavel becomes a Gemeindekind, being left with the impoverished village shepherd Virgil. Met with distrust and rejection, Pavel becomes a criminal and is at the best way of replicating his father's fate in the eyes of the villagers. However, under the guidance of the local teacher Habrecht and his sister Midalda in the convent, Pavel gradually develops self-reflection and moral understanding, which leads him to become a respected community member at the end of the story. Now, Bojena and Das Gemeindekind are told by a heterodiegetic, zero-focalized narrator that represents the diegetic world in a remarkably consistent German Gemeinsprache, a German of daily use with slight variations from the codified written standard. This consistent tone of the narrative voice is remarkable not for what it contains, but rather for what it abstains from. We could say that the first element of Ebner's aesthetics of commonality is a subtle, but politically relevant technique of omission. Especially with regards to the female Czech protagonist of Bojena, contemporary reviews, but also current studies, have noted almost with surprise that a dialectal or orthographically different representation of a direct speech is lacking. Lange, for example, remarks, nicht einmal die Möglichkeit der regionalsprachlichen Stilisierung der Figurenbilder wird genutzt. Such a tone of surprise might reflect the fact that these stylistic devices belong to the standard repertoire of marking alterity, both in extracontinental colonialist discourses or for marking national or ethnic difference inside Central Europe. Marking direct character speech with a dialectal or orthographical variance was a common literary device in the realist genre of the Dorfgeschichte, in whose tradition Ebner is sometimes placed, as well as in exoticizing travel writing, for creating an atmosphere of authenticity and a tinge of local colorit. As post-colonial narratologists have noted, however, varying speech representation was also commonly used in an explicitly chauvinistic manner, to portray ethnic others as cultural inferior, by highlighting their incapability to speak a hegemonic language properly. Crucially, therefore, Ebner seems to have been deliberately trying to avoid to draw an ethnicized hierarchy in her portrayal of multi-ethnic Moravia by not varying the language between her narrators, her Czech-speaking lower-class protagonists, and other characters. That this was a purposeful stylistic choice not to mark ethnic and national difference in this specific political context becomes plausible when looking at her oeuvre more broadly. Notably, Ebner prominently uses techniques of linguistic variation in works that are diegetically set within majority German-speaking territories of the dual monarchy. In Der Muff and Die Totenwacht, she uses dialectal variation to mark social difference or to highlight the rural nature of the diegetic setting. The technique also features prominently in Die Spitzen from 1901, in which the young protagonist Provi, whom the narrator explicitly identifies as an Oberösterreicher, repeatedly demands his daily glass of milk in a strong dialectal idiom, my Milch. So, in the context of multi-ethnic Moravia, where the use of such stylistic variation would have carried a nationally charged subtext, explicit comments by the narrative voice in the Gemeindekind betrays that it is purposefully not narrating certain elements of the diegetic world out of ethical motivations. Cutting its descriptions of Pavel's new home place, the impoverished abode of the shepherd Virgil, short with the remark that a more detailed account would be würdig des Pinsels eines Realisten, ne? The narrative voice highlights its deliberate choice to abstain from an overindulgent description of poverty. While such an abstention from describing social difference places Ebner-Eschenbach firmly within the tradition of an ethically tinted poetic realism, it is noteworthy that she also extends this technique of non-disclosure to the field of national and linguistic relations in her Moravian stories. Abstaining from common stylistic techniques of varied speech representation, Ebner therefore defied both genre conventions of the realist Dorfgeschichte, with its elements of feigned linguistic authenticity, and nationally charged reader expectations of her time. Instead, Božena, Pavel, and other characters with Czech names speak the same German in the representation of the narrator's discourse as characters marked as German speakers, and, this also has to be said, the majority of characters in both works whose nationality remains entirely unclear. Ebner's formal creation of commonality between characters of different national belonging is also enforced in the stylistic microstructure of the texts, for example by parallelisms in Boženas interactions with her employer Heißenstein. Aber das Kind, rief er, das Kind ist da, lebt? Ist da, lebt, wiederholte sie. Ist ein Knabe, setzte er hinzu, ist ein Mädchen, sagte Božena. Secondly, this stylistic sameness questions the very idea of a national split between discrete German and Czech communities in Ebner's Moravian settings. Paradoxically, the linguistic creation of sameness through the universal use of German for all speech representation in the narrative discourse has the effect of creating considerable indeterminacy which languages are in fact spoken between the characters on the level of histoire. Beneath the German discourse of Ebner's narrators, the Moravian settings of her major stories emerges an indeterminate but fundamentally bilingual space that resists a binary division into distinct German, Czech identities alterities. Contrary to Seeling, who claims that die Kommunikation auf Handlungsebene findet in deutscher Sprache statt, I would argue that it remains ambiguous in a majority of cases in which languages the characters in Das Gemeindekind and Božena communicate with each other. Beneath the surface of a universal German, it is not clear in Božena, for example, in which language Božena and her heir, Leopold Heißenstein, interact, nor in which language Božena and Rosa or Röschen communicate. Both German and Czech could be the language of interaction when the Czech Kumis Mansfield Weberlein, Božena, tell stories to Röschen that include tales from Czech history. Neither is it clear in which language Božena and the hunter Bernhard interact in their relationship. Notably, the dialogues between the two Czech characters, Mansfield Weberlein and Božena, are also represented in the same variant of a German Gemeinsprache as all as all other character speech, which makes the discourse an unreliable indicator for the language of communication in the histoire. Linguistic ambiguity is even greater in scenes in which a larger group of characters with Czech or German names interact, such as in dance or marriage scenes in Weinberg's local inn beim Grünen Baum, in Bozena, or a central scene in Das Gemeindekind in which Pavel speaks up against his unjust treatment by the community. Such collective scenes, in which characters carry both German and Czech-sounding names as the only potential indicator of national identification, by default suggest an implicit bilinguality of the present figures and the social strata they represent, rather than being structured along hierarchical national binaries. National indeterminacy and even anti-nationalism also characterizes the teacher Habrecht in Das Gemeindekind, who has been squarely labeled as German in the current literature. Given the text's diegetic setting in the Moravian countryside, it is much more likely that the language of instruction in his village school is indeed Czech, irrespective of the teacher's national affiliation, which suggests at least his occupational bilinguality. Moreover, in a key scene in Das Gemeindekind, when Pavel and his former teacher reunite, Habrecht explicitly voices the anti-nationalist attitude that otherwise informs large parts of the novel's stylistic design implicitly. Noch eins. Sie sind dort noch viel rabiater tschechisch als hier. Mein deutscher Name verdross sie. Sie haben bei mir deutsche Gesinnungen gesucht. Bei mir. Es gibt eine Nation, ja eine. Die leitet, die führt, die voranleuchtet. Alle tüchtigen Menschen. Eher anzugehören wäre ich stolz. Was jeden anderen Nationalitätenstolz betrifft, Narrheit, unwürdig des Jahrhunderts. Gefällt euch mein Name Habrecht nicht, sagte ich, nennt mich Mamprav. Mir gilt das gleich. Now, Habrecht's statement has mostly been read as a negative evaluation of Czech nationalism, which it undoubtedly is. But it is important to note that Habrecht's distinction is not a wir-sie distinction of a German-Czech national antagonism, but a sie-ich distinction against his much more individualistic position. Emphasized by the anaphoric repetition of first-person singular, personal and possessive pronouns, ich, mir, meine, Habrecht juxtaposes his meritocratic concept of community with ethnocultural conceptions of national belonging of any kind. Again, the finely crafted passage formally emphasizes Habrecht's rejection of ethnocultural nationalism in a chiasmus in the central sentence. Es gibt eine Nation, der anzugehören wäre ich stolz. Was jeden anderen Nationalitätenstolz betrifft, Narrheit, unwürdig des Jahrhunderts. Putting his very name at the disposal of the Czech-speaking community in the new village, Habrecht not only displays national indifference towards language use, but also specifically towards acts of naming as a nationalist practice of semantic appropriation. Rejecting the nationalist charging of names, Habrecht contrasts his deutscher Name with deutsche Gesinnungen. And I would argue that this juxtaposition almost seems to contain a metatextual note of caution, namely that a character's German or Czech name in a work of Austro-Hungarian prose fiction does not automatically entail their adherence to a sense of collective national identification, and even less so, that these characters should necessarily be read as the embodiment of essential national qualities. As mentioned above, a reader's judgment whether character names sound Czech or German is one of the only criteria by which the national belonging of characters can at least be implied in Ebner's works. Habrecht's or Mamprav's indifference, mir gilt das gleich, even destabilizes this residual criterion for establishing national identity in a text. And I think it's also mention worthy, for example, in this context that mixed marriages led to a significant spread of German family names among Czech speakers as well in Habsburg Bohemia in the 1820s and 30s. And then lastly, the residual ambiguity about the language of instruction in Habrecht's village school also explains why one prominent exception in Das Gemeindekind, in which Ebner in fact uses orthographic variation prominently to mark Pavel's communication, can also not be read as implying a nationally charged cultural inferiority of its Czech-speaking protagonist. But Pavel's and his mother's letters are littered with capitalization errors and lack punctuation. His sister's Medalda's answers from the convent are represented in error-free standard German. And irrespective of whether the Holub family members write to each other in German or Czech, beneath the German in the discourse, the fact that linguistic variation here occurs within the same family of lower-class Czech-speaking background rather serves as an argument against national determinism by highlighting the different levels of education the family members acquire over the course of the narrative. Now, of course, we could draw on contextual historical information to say that some linguistic constellations in Božena and das Gemeindekind would be more plausible than others. For example, the language of communication between Leopold Heisenstein and his mate Božena in the Histoire likely would have been German. While it was common for Czech-speaking employees in a German-speaking household or family business to attain a functional use of German for professional purposes, German speakers in mid-19th century Bohemia and Moravia often felt much less motivations and incentives to learn Czech. In contrast, the communication between Božena and Rosa or Rüschen would likely be held in Czech or be bilingual. Not only Ebner's own autobiographical account, but also those of other Germanophone Austria-Hungarian writers such as Franz Werfel, Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, or Gregor von Bezzoli exemplify that some degree of primordial linguistic socialization through a Czech or Slavic language nursemaid was not uncommon in Habsburg's Germanophone, aristocratic, and bourgeois circles. However, the far more important, and in my opinion also more interesting point to make, is that Ebner's formal innovativeness in her Moravian works lies in the narrative creation of ambiguity around the language use of characters, despite these historical realities. As post-classical narratologists emphasize, narrative designs never just mimetically reflect sociopolitical realities, but actively perform or challenge notions of collective identity. Language use in the public sphere, and, we might add, the narrative representation of language use in literary works always carried with it this performative dimension in the dual monarchy. And you can see here on the slide in the quote by Judson, this performativity could also pointing in two directions. And in this sense, I would argue Ebner's fuzzy aesthetics of sameness is politically performative. Her blurring who is speaking what languages with which degree of competence in which situation in her Moravian works appears as a subtle but significant formal device to undermine nationalist ideas of separate monolingual communities. Paradoxically, it is precisely through the sameness of German on the level of narratorial discourse that the bilingualism of the Moravian communities comes to the fore. Apart from this general linguistic indeterminacy, there are also singular instances in both texts with which Ebner seems to strategically use Czech language elements to metatextually highlight the bilingual nature of the act of narration itself. In the passage in Das Gemeindekind, members of Soleschau's community council approached the local baroness again, a few days after she agreed to take Pavel's sister Medalda into her care. The narrator reports, eine Deputation begab sich ins Schloss und stellte an die Frau Baronin das untertänigste Ansuchen, weil sie schon so Dobrojita, allergütigst gewesene, sich der Tochter des unglücklichen Holub anzunehmen, möge sie sich nun auch seines Sohnes annehmen. Not only does this passage undermine the stereotypical notion of Czech as an inferior lower-class idiom of servants and peasants, by highlighting that the aristocratic and village council elites in das Gemeindekind speak Czech among themselves. It is also a crucial detail that the narrative voice provides a translation for the Czech words that it takes from the characters in an idiosyncratic form of collectivized free indirect speech. Weil sie schon so dobrowita, allergütigst gewesen. This translation in brackets contains a metaleptic and a metatextual quality, since the text here hints at the bilinguality of its own narrative process, otherwise remaining implicit and hidden beneath the sameness of the German Gemeinsprache for all character speech. The Dobrowita allergütigst makes explicit the narrative's act of translation of an indeterminate amount of Czech into German in the transposition from the histoire to the discourse. Czech, therefore, does not constitute a blind spot for the narrative voice, nor does the narrator in Ebner's works occupy a uniformly German position, or even a männlich preußisches Deutschtum, as Seeling suggests. Being made visible in singular instances, the narrative voice in Ebner's texts emerges as a fundamentally bilingual one as well. So now we have seen that Ebner subverts nationalist binaries through very subtle techniques of omission and indeterminacy. Given the very subtlety by which she highlighted commonality and the bilingual nature of her homeland, the author, however, also seems to have refrained from political advocacy for the Czech national and linguistic emancipation in the last decades of the Habsburg Empire. With the language on a level of histoire being mostly indeterminate and with only sparse insertions of Czech language elements, Ebner merely hints at the facticity of multilingualism in Moravia without nationally charging it. And I would argue that this aesthetics of sameness is significant and politically performative precisely in this subtlety, because it represented one of the worst fears of German and Czech nationalists of Ebner's time alike, namely, that people in the latter half of 19th century Austria-Hungary might have spoken multiple or even just one language without attaching a politicized sense of national identification to them. As Judson remarks, everyday pragmatic multilingual coexistence in Austria-Hungary constituted a fact that would have been difficult for anxious nationalists and also many historians to accept. And I think this also raises questions of interpretive practices today. In the crucially important task of examining colonial or nationalist ideologies of difference-making and othering, we should also be careful not to perpetuate and reenact these ideologies by mapping binary identity frameworks into texts that, even if ever so subtly, undermine them. At a time when ideas of rigid ethnocultural national separation were more and more aggressively propagated, it is exactly the absence and the subtle hint at more complex bilingual realities that constitute a fundamental element of an alternative aesthetics of similarity in Ebner's works. So, even when looking at the basic formal category of narrative language use, the design of Das Gemeindekind and Božena therefore destabilizes, rather than confirms, the binary perspectives the nationalist discourses propagated at the time when Ebner published most of her stories. Nevertheless, there are two final and critical aspects about the function of German in her works that should not be left unmentioned. While it would be tempting to chime into the current rediscovery of Ebner-Eschenbach as a quite modern author by representing her as the advocate of transnational post-monolingual communities, the narrative design of her works also contains a conservative strand. It pointed to the preservation of the status quo in late 19th century Austria-Hungary, if not, in fact, to a pre-national feudal past. Firstly, it has to be said that Ebner's aesthetics of sameness are not impartial. One aspect I have not been able to discuss in this lecture is that Jewish characters seem conspicuously excluded from the linguistic creation of sameness the writer enforces elsewhere. And this is especially puzzling in light of Ebner's public engagement against the rise of modern-day racist anti-Semitism in Vienna in the 1890s. Nevertheless, from her anonymously published prose fiction debut Aus Franzensbad from 1858 to later works such as Der Vorzugsschüler from 1901, the representation of Jewish character speech in a stereotypical Mauscheln remained a stylistic constant in her oeuvre, sometimes connected to a clearly negative portrayal of Jewish side characters, such as for the Jewish innkeeper Dornenkron in her novella Der Kreismusikus from 1883. Compared to the deliberate abstention from such literary techniques when it comes to her Czech-speaking characters, the fact that Ebner more readily adopted anti-Semitic tropes seems a highly startling aspect of her works. Moreover, if the sameness of her narrative's discourse manifests an anti-nationalist thrust, the use of German for effecting this sameness is in itself not neutral. With the egalitarian sameness of German speech representation for all characters in das Gemeindekind in Božena, Ebner-Eschenbach, if inadvertently or not, ultimately reproduced the long-held hegemonic attitude of imperial policymakers across the 19th century. The Germans somehow stood above the petty pursuit of selfish sectarian interests in which other nationalists engaged. Critics of political discourse, from Goethe to intersectional studies on whiteness, noted in this respect that hegemonic positions often appear as an unnamed and unquestioned neutral normative default. This nominalization renders invisible, firstly, that a hegemonic position, too, is just one particular position within a hierarchical matrix of differentiation. And secondly, it renders invisible the mechanisms that make that particular subject position appear as a neutral standard. That Ebner-Eschenbach rejected radikale Umstürze generell und daher auch in der tschechischen Frage as zoning rights, positioned her almost by default as playing into that invisibility and the preservation of the status quo, despite her sympathies for the Czech-speaking lower classes in her homeland. Throughout her life, Ebner remained skeptical about the Czech national emancipation and favored a quasi-feudal model of patronage based on Christian humanism and responsibility, in whose tradition she saw her own class, the Bohemian aristocracy, to stand in. Now, while neither the heterodiegetic narrative voice of das Gemeindekind nor of Božena occupies a clearly identifiable intersectional position of nation and class, the formal treatment of its lower-class Czech-speaking characters could ultimately be said to perform this model of patronage. The representation of their speech renders them as equal to everyone else in the diegetic world, and this narrative process literally unfolds as the creation of imperial unity under the auspices of the superordinate German language of the narrative's discourse. It is noteworthy as well in this context that despite retaining a competence in Czech throughout her life, Ebner not once considered making Czech her literary language, nor engaged significantly with the emerging Czech literary culture. This is an important qualification of her egalitarian aesthetics in her portrayal of multi-ethnic Moravia. So, despite undermining national binaries and subtly foregrounding bilingualities, Ebner's texts do not ultimately go formally as far as to interrogate the political implications of the use of German for affecting the sameness in her works, nor does she interrogate the claim of neutrality that came with the hegemonic position the German language undeniably occupied for most of the 19th century. So, how far, therefore, did Ebner-Eschenbach's aesthetics of sameness ultimately go? And how far did her deep feeling of empathy with the Czech-speaking lower classes of Moravia, indeed, her self-professed Gefühl der Verwandtschaft mit ihnen, da ich ja in Zieslawitz geboren war, enable her to formally represent them in a way that evaded the ethical dilemmata of speaking on behalf of those whose suffering and injustices we do not share. In a brief last part of this lecture, I want to highlight that the author seems to have been keenly aware that her own intersectional position as an aristocratic German language writer within the Habsburg Empire might have set a potentially epistemological boundary to the representation of lower-class Czech characters in her works. The negotiation of these concerns can be seen in the novella Lass die Hand küssen from 1886. As one of her most formally complex works, Lass die Hand küssen is a remarkably self-reflexive text, with which Ebner raised poetological and political questions about the representation of others, or rather, those being othered, that are as topical today as they were at the time of the emergence of nationalist ideologies in Central Europe. At the same time, in the form of a refined double-edged critique, this text also provides a sort of metatextual justification for socially and politically engaged literature against all odds. And just to give the basic structure, so Lass die Hand küssen consists of a frame narrative, in which account tells a Gräfin the story einer kleinen Übereilung of his grandmother. This expression turns out to be a drastic euphemism as the account unfolds its intradiegetic enclosed narrative. set at a time, in denen wir noch das Jus gladii ausübten, as the Count says, the action of the enclosed narrative seems to take place before the introduction of a uniform penal law in the Austrian Empire during the 1770s, when the biopolitical power over subjects lay in the hands of feudal elites. And Erlass die Handküssen emerges as a tale of the blatant abuse of precisely that power. After catching sight of the laborer Mischka beim Erntefest, the Count's grandmother, motivated by unacknowledged erotic desire, orders her serf to work in her castle gardens. After learning that Mischka has a partner and child, whom the Countess mistakes for siblings as first, she seeks to control Mischka and embarks on a spiral of decisions that ultimately lead to the separation of the family and the death of its members in Mischka. To highlight the blatant injustice of Mischka's treatment by his grandmother, the Count lets his tale converge into a drastic but effective pun at the end. Mischka's alleged obedience to her grandmother's orders, which her messenger Fritz always reports with the same eponymous formula, turns out to having been an empty, devout phrase from the mouth of the servile Fritz himself all along. When Mischka is beaten to death before the message of his pardon reaches him, Fritz reports, lass die Hand küssen, ist schon tot. This narrative constellation enables Ebner-Eschenbach to raise critical questions about the ethics and poetics, the empathetic representation of disenfranchised others. Most crucially, through the text framing device. Charlotte Woodford has observed in the context of the sentimental novel and female suffering that Ebner often subverted rather than conformed to the conventional use of realist techniques of writing. The same could be said with respect to the framing device in Lass die Hand küssen and Ebner's depictions of social and ethically coded injustices in multi-ethnic Austria-Hungary as well. If realist fiction often uses framing devices to create an effect of heightened authenticity, by isolating the unfolding intradiegetic action from the interference of the text's overarching narrator, Ebner uses the framing device in Lass die Hand küssen as a self-reflexive device to question the very idea of narrative authenticity. Secondary literature has always remarked in this context that the narrative frame of the novella critically interrogates the claims of texts to reflect reality, especially the reality of those who have been speechless and powerless. Most prominently, this happens through the Gräfin in the frame narrative, which constantly challenges the narrative reliability of the Count's account of his grandmother. And he mainly does that with frequent interjections. And just to quote a particularly striking instance, there's a passage in the text where Mischka, where the Count claims to in fact know the feelings of Mischka with a sense of near embodiment. And this is again vehemently rejected by his interlocutor. Der Mischka schämte sich in seine Haut hinein. Es ist doch stark, dass sie jetzt gar in der Haut Mischkas stecken wollen, fuhr die Gräfin höhnisch auf. And yet, I would argue that there's a wider self-critical dynamic at play in Lass die Hand küssen. This critique is already subtly present in the very first sentence of the novella. So reden Sie denn in Gottes Namen, sprach die Gräfin. Ich werde Ihnen zuhören, aber glauben nicht ein Wort. So, even before the Count has started his narration, and irrespective of its content, the Gräfin displays a dismissive attitude and does not seem to want the story to be true. While the Gräfin's remark in this instance could result from a general disengagement, they later gain an overtly political dimension. There's a point about 2/3 into the narrative of Lass die Hand küssen, when the nature of the Gräfin's constant interjections change from questioning the reliability of the Count to urging him to move on with the story. While Borley argues that the Countess simply succumbs to the Count's narrative power, a detailed look at these instances suggests a very different reading. So, when the Graf describes Mischkas mother, he claims, Sie, liebe Freundin, kennen Sie, wie ich sie kenne. Ich soll sie kennen. Sie lebt noch? Fragte die Gräfin ungläubig. Sie lebt, nicht im Urbilde zwar, aber in vielfachen Abbildern. Das kleine, schwächliche, immer bebende Weiblein, and the Graf continues to describe Mischkas mother, until the Gräfin interrupts. Weiter, weiter, sprach die Gräfin. Sind Sie bald zu Ende? In the second instance in which the Gräfin urges the Count to quickly move on, the letter also ironically suggests that the Countess has some experiential or shared knowledge about the abuse of biopolitical power committed by her own class. Der Samstag war nämlich zu jener Zeit, deren sie, diesem Worte gab der Graf eine besondere, sehr schlaghafte Betonung, sich unmöglich besinnen können, der Tag der Exekutionen. Da wurde die Bank vor das Amtshaus gestellt. Weiter, weiter, sagte die Gräfin. Halten Sie sich nicht auf mit den unnötigen Details. So, every time the Count suggests that the Gräfin in the frame narrative knows the misery of lower-class women very well, and when he reminds the Gräfin of the corporeal punishments that their ancestors were responsible for, he violently dismisses the subject. As extrapolating from Miranda's Fricker's concept of epistemic injustice, one could say that the Gräfin here exerts a form of epistemic ignorance, a deliberate, as Fricker puts it, denial of some uncomfortable truths and a conscious resistance to accepting or learning about the source for one's own social advantage. Such a denial is, as Fricker also terms it, epistemically culpable, since it involves an interested or motivated cognitive bias in not wanting to be confronted with social realities and questions about the perpetuation of injustice through that very attitude. Apart from a potentially unreliable interdiegetic narrator, Lass die Hand küssen therefore features what I would like to coin as an unreliable narratee in the Gräfin, a fictive interlocutor that deliberately challenges, denies, or ignores the truth claims of a narrative out of dubious motives, such as personal discomfort or the rejection of responsibility. It is very interesting in this context that there is disagreement about the Gräfin's age in the secondary literature. While Borley contains that the Gräfin of the frame narrative is as elderly as the white-bearded Count, Meyer and Adam hold that she is a junge Gräfin. And yeah, through the Count's ironic remarks, excuse me, I might just go back here. Through the Count's ironic remarks quoted above, zu jener Zeit, deren sie sich unmöglich besinnen können, it is, however, the very ambiguity about the Gräfin's age that maximizes the critical potential of the texts, since it suggests an intergenerational historical complicity with respect to the aristocratic treatment of the lower classes. For this other half of Ebner's self-reflexive critique, it is ultimately irrelevant how reliable the Count's narration is. His tale functions as an exemplary story about the aristocratic abuse of power against disenfranchised others, and his fictive interlocutor functions as an object of critique in her epistemic ignorance and avoidance of the subject at hand. In this way, Lass die Hand küssen therefore features both a politological and a class-focused aristocratic self-critique, a double-edged critique, the intersectionally privileged position from which Ebner-Eschenbach wrote herself. Via the unreliability of the Count as a narrator, she negotiates questions about the limits of empathetic representation of our lower-class others, and therefore also of her own literary and aesthetic project of advocacy for the mostly Czech-speaking populace of her homeland. Ultimately, the novella does provide no solutions for the ethics and dilemmas of representation. With the equally self-reflexive Gräfin as an unreliable narratee, however, the novella nevertheless seems to contain a clear call for a politically engaged literature. Ebner highlights that disengagement and the shying away from these difficult questions is no alternative either. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.